want to invite on the stage Flavio Gregori, the responsible for the university activities and cultural relations.
Invitiamo ora sul palco Flavio Gregori, prorettore alle attività e rapporti culturali di Ateneo.
Thank you very much for this wonderful invitation. Thank Roberta for this 8th edition of Short Film Festival. The Short, it has become The Short, its nickname. Thank you all for being here, and thanks especially to Peter Greenaway for having accepted the invitation to come to Venice and to this festival. I was allowed by Peter Greenaway to say a few, you know him, so probably this is plenastic, but I was allowed to say a few words about him. He was born in Newport, Wales, and as you know, he's one of the greatest and most innovative directors of our time. He's also a painter, curator, an experimenter with digital media, a philosopher of cinema, an historian of cinema and arts, many other things. He's a full-fledged artist, he's a tutto tondo, all round. Critical of mainstream cinema, Peter Greenaway supports the idea that cinema should go much beyond the boundaries of narration the film industry imposed over the medium and over the evocative as well as interpretative power of images. Thus, he experimented many forms of expression, from feature films to painting, opera, television, multimedia, and other formats, including VJ. He studied in North London at the Walthamstow College of Art, where he learned several techniques that he would later adopt in his works and performances, from painting to collage to other various forms of material expression, that had also the function of increasing his interest, which is deep, profound interest in literature intersecting with the arts, not only in the sense of the so-called pictura poesis, but also as poesia pictura. When he was 22 years old, he started to experiment with cinematic forms. In those pre-digital times, you had to acquire a camera and make, it is physically make, direct and edit your own film, your physical films, reels. And this is what Peter Greenaway did, also through his experience as editor of documentaries for a UK governmental office. He made his first experimental short films in the 60s, notably Train, 1966, in which he filmed a steam train pulling into a station, possibly, but this is conjectural, inspired by the Lumiere brothers' arrival at La Ciotat station. Tree, 1966. Windows, 1975, in which a story told by voiceover contrasts with an idyllic landscape scene through several windows. Vertical Features remake, A Walk Through Age, both 1978, visual journeys through mathematical structures and maps. It won't be too long, don't worry. Greenaway's first feature film was a mockumentary in 92 parts entitled The Falls, 1980. Set in a dystopian future following a mysteriously violent unknown event, it shows a group of 92 people suffering from inexplicable diseases and obsessions. The 1980s saw the appearance of some of Peter Greenaway's best feature films, if this definition, feature film, is applicable to his films at all. The Draftsman's Contract, which was his official debut on the market in 1982, As Eden to North, 1985, The Belly of an Architect, 1987, Drowning by Numbers, 1988. In 1990, The Cook, The Thief, His Wife and a Lover was released, a highly successful as well as controversial film, portraying the young wife of a vicious gangster who, the wife, has an affair with a bookshop owner. The film possesses a heightened theatrical quality, mixes up sadism, sense of guilt, inhumanity, and humanity, culminating in a sort of orgiastic ending in which revenge and love, Liebe und Tod, combine in a very dramatic way. Prosperous books followed, a visually astonishing reinterpretation of Shakespeare's The Tempest, 1991, I mean Prospero's books, not The Tempest, combine elements of theatrical experience, dance, music, visual pyrotechnics, as well as first-class recitation by Sir John Gielgud in the role of Prospero. Then The Baby of Macon, 1993, The Pillow Book, 1996, this one an adaptation of a Japanese classic of erotic literature in which sex and text become part of the audience's visual experience, and 8.5 Women, 1999, inspired by Fellini's masterpiece, 8.5. In 2004, Peter Greenaway produced a trilogy entitled The Chelsea Looper Suitcases. I mispronounced the name, but I was told him by him before, but I've already forgotten the proper pronunciation. It was a large project encompassing feature films, a TV series, 92 DVDs, and several CD-ROMs and books, and displaying highly innovative techniques. Chelsea Looper, the wolf on your pulse, is a recurring off-stage character in his early films and can be seen as a sort of his alter ego, a professional writer whose life has been reconstructed from the objects found in his 92 suitcases. By the way, the figure 92 corresponding to the atomic number of uranium. In the last years, Greenaway has focused on an artistic project entitled 9 Classic Paintings, in which he employs groundbreaking image technology to explore 9 masterpieces from the Renaissance to Jackson Pollock. He focused on Rembrandt's painting The Night Watch in his Night Watching, 2007, providing an interpretation of the mystery behind that painting, and with the quasi-documentary J'accuse, 2008, Greenaway criticized the hypocritical society in which Rembrandt created his masterpieces, as well as our contemporary inability to read and understand art. Then he explored Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, L'Ultima Cena. In 2009, he presented the digital exploration, as you well know, of Paolo Veronese's The Wedding at Cana at the Venice Biennale. Those projects and artworks were followed by Goldzius and the Pelican Company, 2012, Einstein in Mexico, 2015, Churchin, Matisse, Dance and Music, 2016. Peter Greenaway is also the author of a theatrical performance, El Planeta Azul, The Blue Planet, 2008, which he wrote and directed with the musical help of Saskia Bodeke for the Saragossa International Expo, and of several art installations, including Bologna Towers, Bologna 2000, Children of Uranium, Genoa and Naples, 2005, Rembrandt's Mirror, Rotterdam, 2007, the already mentioned L'Ultima Cena di Leonardo, The Towers, Luca Hybris, Luca, 2013, and of books and art books. On his agenda, as far as we can read on his website, there is now a project entitled 55 Men on Horseback, based on the late 18th century tale of a man who tries to bed a woman by sending her 55 paintings of horses, and a Russian epic entitled Augsbergenfeld, and many, many other things which I cannot mention for reasons of time, because it's high time for me to call Peter Greenaway on floor. Thank you very much.
Well, after that rather extensive and highly pleasurable for me, if not for you, introduction, I've obviously got to have to respond and try and intrigue and entertain you and justify some of the items indeed which you've just heard about. This is a short film festival. So many filmmakers begin their career certainly by experimenting with short films, costing less money. Unfortunately, short films very, very rarely get to those public places where they should indeed be, since the center, I suppose, of cinematic activity is always associated with the feature film. As you gather, I suspect from some of the dates you just heard about, I've been making films now for at least 4 decades. And I think in that period of time, a huge amount of changes have happened to the general notions of cinematography. And I know I don't want to bore you with old credo, but I think in some curious way we've come to the end of traditional cinema. I don't think we have to shed any tears for that. I'm sure the progress of culture has always suggested that what happens next is almost inexorably more successful than what has passed. But I think the idea of the cinema of our fathers and forefathers is really basically no longer with us. I think two general ideas which I'd like to throw at you for suggesting that cinema in a curious way has come to an ending are the following. First of all, cinema to my grandfather, and probably to my parents as well, was some social phenomenon where you went out as soon as it got dark, in company, friends, strangers, of course, and you viewed films on very large screens with very loud soundtracks in company. And you know how it works now, although of course you can indeed see big, magnificent films on those sorts of lines. My parents would have gone to the cinema 3 times a week. I bet everybody's parents in this room hardly ever goes to the cinema now once a month. Am I right? Or do you all have extraordinary cinephile, excited filmgoers who frequently would have gone, as certainly people did in the heyday of cinema, which is certainly just before the Second World War and certainly after it. They tell me the very height of cinematic enthusiasm is 1963. I was 21 in 1963, and I think that's the year of the Beatles' Magical Mystery Tour. No reason to believe that any of these things by any manner of means come together. But it's interesting to consider that probably since 1963, the idea of big, public, highly viewable cinema has slowly been eroded. And I rather suspect, no surprise to any of us, that most of you, even though you are touched, of course, with cinema education, is spent, the notion of cinema habit, not on big screens, but on little tiny screens you carry in your pocket, or on television, or on some form of DVD. So we've ended up watching cinema virtually on our own, either in bed, or sitting on the sofa at home, or in some office situation. And we probably watch cinema virtually on our own, or with maybe just 1 or 2 other people. That seems to me to be a very significant change when we consider what we thought cinema was all about. That's one particular way of looking at what I would regard as the decline of cinematic experience. And I suppose the other thing is, from 1895 to 1929, there was a phenomenon called the silent cinema. I don't believe cinema has ever been silent, and there's always evidence that some sort of soundtrack manufactured by some sort of technology was always on the cards. But if you look at that gap from, 1895 to 1929, it's reckoned at least 25 million, and I think that's a conservative element, at least 25 million films were manufactured all over the world. But who looks at so-called silent cinema now? Put your hands up. This is not a rhetorical question. Who looks at silent cinema? Not exactly a massive flurry of hands. And I always feel that when people look at silent cinema, probably for 2 reasons. To entertain children with Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin at Christmas. And second, if you're an academic and not necessarily a film academic, but you're a historian and social commentator, we use cinema, for example, if somebody wants to know what Chicago trams looked like in 1810, they will go and search for a piece of film to tell them. So it's become essentially, I suppose, a sort of, if not nostalgia, a sort of academic exercise. But the point of me saying this, obviously variations on a theme, because some of you put your hands up. There is a way that basically 30-odd years of silent cinema has very largely been forgotten. And I feel, for all the same reasons, that sound cinema will go the same way, and is going that way very, very rapidly. I am convinced my great-grandchildren will say, cinema? What was that? But I don't want you in any manner or means to feel disappointed, though please, if anybody wants to be a film director in the next 10 years, I suggest you forget it and go and do something more valuable, more relevant to human imagination, and certainly much more associated with the way we live now. And even worse, if any of you pretend to be, as we say, critical film writers, your days are numbered. Perhaps you've got 3 more years. The actual amount and quality of cinema writing now is very bad, very poor, and very small. Certainly not true when I came of age in the 60s. Enormous amounts of film magazines of great intellectual stamina and credibility all over the world, and certainly in this country. But if you count the number of serious notions of cinematic critical intelligence, it seems to get less and less and less. Okay, I'm not going to go on being a Jeremiah, if you think I am. I don't think I am, because as I suggested, what comes next, arriving out of our much more intimate association with social media and all it will stand for, will be far more, in the end, exciting. Okay, well, what I want to do really tonight, I'm only being given an hour and a half. One of my great heroes, Buckminster Fuller, could talk for 8 hours and not bore anybody. I promise you, certainly not to bore you, and certainly not to talk for 8 hours. But I do need, I think, to entertain you. It was a great work of art. Something like Ovid suggested every great work of art has to be 50% entertainment, but also 50% instruction. If it's merely entertainment, then you've forgotten it the following afternoon, and if it's merely instruction, you've all left the cinema thoroughly bored already. So we have to play that extraordinarily difficult game, of which there are really no theories of how to do it, is to make works of art which are both entertaining and instructive. Okay, I'm making bold statements here, because you're going to look at what I'm going to show you, and you're going to say, justification here is maybe not so great as Greenaway might imagine it to be. So what I've done is some, I suppose, an overall prospectus of the 40 years I've been making films, is to show you 14 short films. Some of them were made back in the 1970s on a Bolex camera with a spring loading of only 17 seconds, which I assure you is a rather good discipline. You always know you can never make a shot longer than 17 seconds. And obviously, it's almost in the early days of color sophisticated photography, so a lot of those films are in black and white. We actually thought in those days that the quality was very good, but compared to what you have nowadays, of course, I won't say the quality was deplorable, but it is really, really, really vastly inferior to what we every day perfectly expect. The qualities of extraordinary high resonance in picture making are, even for me, somebody who practices it every day, always extraordinarily impressive. And towards the end of these 14 short sections, I will try to make a demonstration of how amazing the technology has become. All right, the process is then that I introduce each film briefly. I have a list here of 14 items. I haven't put them in any chronological order, deliberately, and they are all very, very different, both in terms of medium, but also, indeed, a presentation of cinematic intelligence, I'd like to think, and also are presented, when they were first made, in different sorts of contexts. And a lot of those contexts are not just simply in a cinema, however large, however small, but in conjunction with other sorts of activity, a lot of that other activity being related, I suppose, to notions of real-life theatre And certainly, although it's one thing, certainly filmmaking I'm never able to do. I cannot compose music, but that has a very, very high musical content. What I will also do, and this actually shows the medium is the message, I've got a list here of, I suppose, nearly 200 items that I could show you, but I'm sure that would either bore you and certainly would go on until tomorrow midnight. So I will select it from my menu. Let me find my menu. Here it is. You can see a huge number of connections here, which would take an incredible long time to go through. And I will begin, as I was suggesting, that these films are not necessarily, as it were, purely neat, that is to say, just presented as a projection on a screen in a public proscenium situation like this. And the first one I've chosen was the result of an Italian commission by the Design Museum in Milan. We've always called it simply the Design Triennale. Every 3 years they put on some special effect which refers to the magnificent Italian design, not just in cinema, but right across the board. And as an introduction to this exhibition, I was asked to make some form of cinematic presentation. They suggested that I should only make it since the Second World War, but that didn't seem to me entertaining or exciting enough. And they really stayed very largely, I suppose, in what could be described as the craft area of our cultural experience, as opposed to what might be described, and I hope I'm not accused of cultural snobism here, of the art department of cultural activity. But one of the things, and I think it's a characteristic of all my cinema, I try to make very self-reflexive. That is to say, a lot of these films are about films. A lot of these films are about film culture, film attitudes, film notions, and always, because I always think this is a high degree of intelligence, are always making a comment along the lines of the medium is the message. Okay, that's a super overused statement of the early 1960s by McLuhan, but still remains, I think, very seriously very important. So here is a project then, which to begin with, it does not exist on one screen, but a whole series of screens, and all those screens are not this necessarily over-familiar idea of a rectangle with 4 right angles. We don't need to play cinema that way anymore. And look at you, you're all in a minute going to be in the dark, and cinema ceased to be important in the dark anymore. I've seen presentations in public spaces in Naples at noon of extraordinary, sharp and beautiful dramatization which need not be frightened of the noonday Naples sun. So one of the first things I wanted to query was why in fact are we still attached to this notion of a rectangular screen? The answer is not. We do not need to be. So I invented 7 screens. I cannot show you directly what they are. In other presentations that would certainly have been possible because the program has not been arranged in that way. So I'm going to plunge straight into the film. So this is a film, piece of Italian propaganda, if you like, made by a non-Italian to celebrate at least, I suppose, 2,000 years of Italian culture. And take a look at the way it's organized. It can only be made on computers, so it has to have been a product made certainly in the last 12 years. The screens are all different shapes, different sizes, very, very large. Already, I think, from this diagram, you see there is a little figure of a red man, obviously an Italian communist, to give you a sense of scale. And the scale was absolutely huge. And you can imagine, there's one of the screens which represents, in a sense, a quarter of the Earth's surface. I have to talk, of course, in 2 dimensions here. I'm absolutely convinced that you believe, like me, that cinema, despite Avatar, is certainly a 2-dimensional medium, and any attempt to make it 3-dimensional somehow seems not to understand cinema very well. Okay, let me show you then. We have called it simply Design Triennale, and let's push a button and see if we can make the whole thing work. Two things you can certainly see there already is there is no attempt to tell you a story. I think stories are a waste of time in cinema. My God, isn't that provocative? It's rather a sad thing, I always think, that people basically go to the cinema to be told a story. And I don't think the cinema is very good at telling stories. That's not what its main excitement, its main enthusiasm, its main sense of energy. And I'm sure we can understand how I can argue that. When you go to a cinema, you don't really remember the story. It's only a device in which to put the bricks and the ideas together. So it is best. The notion of a story is only the cement, is only the lime that holds the really interesting things together. And what you remember about Blade Runner, what you remember about Casablanca, what you remember about Star Wars, is that particular extraordinary and very, very cinematic phenomenon of putting image to idea, to music, to sound. That's what you come away with in a form of remembrance. So why don't we make it absolutely essential that our movie making is related to that, not to the notion of storytelling? A lot of people would regard W.W. Griffiths as being one of the major creators of the cinematic world. I think he was its curse. You know how he is always regarded as introducing narrative into cinema? Shame, shame, shame. If you want to have, and I seriously believe we do have, a writer's cinema and not an image maker's cinema, just think about that for 1 minute. Every single film you've probably seen almost certainly started life as a text. So that films, in a curious way, are no more than illustrations of text. So we need not have been like this. We could have organized things very differently. We could have propounded, though it's very, very difficult to realize that the notion, should we say, of a painter's cinema and not a writer's cinema. However, it hasn't worked off like that. I think basically, and here's an accusation for all of you people in the audience, that most people are visually illiterate. Who in the audience really thinks that they are visually literate? That you are as visually literate as you are literate? That cannot be, can it? How many people spend as much time on considering, making, manufacturing, imagining their image, and all it stands for, as they do in actually using literary means of communication every single day? Certainly before you came to the cinema, and certainly when you go, you're going to be talking, you're going to be reading, and the sophistication of your literacy is very high. But the amount of people who actually know very much about painting, about image making, really is, despite an age, information age, and the use of the internet, remarkably low. When you talk to people and you talk about images, you would realize, I'm sure you'd agree with me, how curiously naive and primitive people's visual comprehension is. This is really rather extraordinary, isn't it? We've had 1895, we've had 120 years minimum of cinema. Don't you think that ought to make us much more visually excitable, much more visually interested? Let me ask you again, how many people in the audience actually do believe that what I'm saying is a pack of nonsense and you're all incredibly visually literate? Be bold. Who really believes themselves to be visually literate? Because then I will ask you, what sort of education have you had? You know, all of you, most of you are still students of one form or another. You know, you've spent at least the first, 20 years of your life being educated, but very largely through literary means and not visual means. Okay, you're a bit exceptional because a lot of you are deeply associated with the filmmaking habit, which supposedly is about visual images. But you've only got to watch, 6 months worth of films to realize what you are watching really, basically, for 90% of the time, is illustrated text. There is a really interesting ironic problem here, Because if you think about the history in the Western world of painting, most of that has been illustrated text. Right up to post-impressionism, let's think of somebody like Monet, most, not all, but most painting was illustrated text, and very largely text, look at the ceiling here, of imagery from a religious, Christian, probably Roman Catholic point of view. On the whole, Protestants don't like images, or they like them less even than Catholics. And if it's not going to be illustrations from the Bible of one sort or another, real or metaphorical, it'll be illustrations of ancient text, normally Roman or Greek, and I can especially say that in a country of Italy. So we have to wait an incredible long time, certainly in what, 7,000 years probably, for the notion of the image to separate itself, to cut its umbilical cord with notions of text. I think the greatest century we've ever had, painting for example, certainly starts with Monet's view of Westminster Abbey in, I think it's 1861. And that's the time when painting finally did not need the prop, did not need the succedaneum, did not need the excuse of having to illustrate some literary idea in order to have a fully fledged existence. So, the latter end of the 19th century, the whole of the 20th century are surely the best times for painting, because painting finally had the courage to go out without being a cripple. Okay, if I move that whole idea into filmmaking, I would now argue that filmmaking, if it's going to survive, and I've already given you a poor prognosis of that possibility, it'll have to separate itself from the bookshop. We really do have to cut that umbilical cord between the bookshop and cinema. And it's there all the time, isn't it? How many more versions of Jane Austen are we going to see? How many more Shakespeare plays are we going to see? How many more repetitions of familiar literary subject matter with beginnings, middles, and ends based upon cheap psychological intervention in a Hollywood way? How are we going to continue to be able to breathe new life into what extraordinary apologists of the cinema in the 1900s and 1910s said? They believe that cinema would really be magnificently original and different, and a medium that can really stand on its own feet. I believe basically most cinema now is bedtime stories for adults, and it is highly illustrated. I don't want to make illustrations of literary phenomena. I want to make pure primary cinema. Okay, maybe I'm aiming incredibly high, and you have indeed every excuse to question the possibilities of finding a cinema which is picture-based and not illustrative. But we pursue, I think we pursue, and we can continue. And I always thought the digital revolution was one of the supreme ways that we could get away from bookshop-orientated cinema. Related to that, of course, if it itches, you have to scratch it. I am sure there's an Italian proverb that says the same thing. If it irritates me, if it antagonizes me, then I'm going to continue to pursue and find out exactly what is the problem and what we can do about it. Let me pass on to a next film, which is called Writing on Water. Okay, two rag rules to the bull there. First of all, the word writing is included, and I've been so much against the notion of writing. But again, let me repeat, if it itches, you must scratch it. Okay, this goes on for about half an hour, and I'm not going to give you any more of it. Move on to the next item, but this again has a particular relevance, which isn't relative to the notion of sheerly just being a short film. Often within movies, as I'm sure you know, there are, as it were, inbuilt videos or inbuilt exemplars, which are essentially cut to music and in some curious way can be abstracted. Many years ago in Japan, I made a film called The Billbook. And I want to show you that inbuilt in it, in a sense, was a short film, which was, I suppose, like a video clip. Okay, I don't know, I think it was mentioned in the introduction, I was very interested in the Japanese female writer, Sei Shonagon, who was writing extraordinary poetry around about the year 1000, almost impossible. I suspect, to be able to remotely translate into any form of other European language. Let me show you this. Okay, back to Italy. In the north of Italy, there is an extraordinarily beautiful town called Lucca, completely surrounded by a Roman wall. Has 101 churches, though I have to say I tried to find them all but couldn't. But there is a way that it has a great sense of history. It's where the first triumvirate came together to collapse the Roman Republic and begin the empire. And we have asked Morgan Freeman to play a major role, which is basically about a New York journalist who wants to write serious literature, who goes to Lucca ostensibly to look for his grandmother, but also to find space to write a book of, and you've heard the number mentioned already this evening, 92 stories about the prospect of death. I would argue there are only two subject matters. One is sex, and the other is death. What on earth else is there of any value to be able to talk about? I think Balzac reckoned that money was an important subject, but so many stupid people who've got money can hardly be a really entertainingly serious subject matter to discuss. And I'm very sorry, but every single person in this room, I'm very sorry to tell you, is going to die. So the very beginning and the very ending, surely, are the important subject matters, and you run your finger down all the cultural activities of, I certainly, Western and probably the world's cultural activities. They're either about the first moments of copulation and those last moments of death. All literature, a large part of it, certainly cinema, has made sex and death its major subject matter. Just consider the last 10 films you've seen in Hollywood cinema. I'm pretty certain that sex was in it, and I'm also pretty certain that death was there. So I think these are, the basic subject matters. I suppose the notion, if you think about Shakespeare, would be the idea of power. But do you not think the pursuit of sex and the pursuit of death have subsumed in them these particular great sense of anxieties, being sex and death? The next film on my list is called Not Mozart. No, it isn't. It's indeed what I'm saying. It's about Lucca. It's about this. Indeed this extraordinary city. And as you probably know, in the north of Italy there are many cities which have many towers. I've always been fascinated by this preactive concern for building huge towers, which in a sense had no function whatsoever. They were a form of showing off and self-aggrandizement. And there are certainly the remains of some really interesting tall towers in Lucca, and I wrote a whole series of stories about these towers. And going back to my anxiety about narrativity and how to deal with it, I tried to find ways of acknowledging the narrative, if you like, but by no means necessarily in the conventional way. It's certainly as highly visual as I can make it, but it does not in any particular way directly concern itself with ideas of illustration. Let me see if I can show you this. Okay, a commission from the BBC. You filmmakers in the audience know that the primacy of the image normally rules the roost. So a film director, filmmaker, first of all, conceives the idea indeed of the schemata that's associated with the manufacture of the image, and then afterwards contacts a composer to come and write music from him or her. Well, the BBC thought about turning this around to ask a series of important, probably very modern-making European composers to make a film related to musical history, in this particular case with the early career of Mozart, but to write the music and then find a filmmaker of their choosing to be able to make the complementary pictures. So we have a film here which I have called simply Not Mozart, because it is, and if you're good Mozart fans, you will recognize many, many musical quotes. but also a whole series which indeed are entirely related to the originality of the composer. And the composer in my case was Holland's Dutch most avant-garde and famous composer, a gentleman called Louis Andriessen. Let me show you what we did. Okay, the film goes on for about a half an hour, but I think you've seen enough to get an idea of the language. You know how the genre of cinema always sticks very narrowly to the particular characteristics of one sort of filmmaking. Here I wanted to be able to, of course, put live action with animation, and also a great sense of painterliness in terms of the shallow screen area. So we have a combination of painting, animation, and live action. And of course the actual organization of the time element. Always for me, I'm looking for really very simple non-narrative ways in which to be non-anecdotal in a narrative way. And here, as in many other cases with a lot of my movies, I have used very simple structure of the alphabet. Certainly in England, I don't know, I think there are more letters in the alphabet, are there not, in France? But there is a way we always know that there are 26 letters, and when you reach the letter M, you're at the center of the project. So in a sense, it's a film that advertises its future as well as its present. Let me show you something which is really very, very close to home, and I revalued it all over again when I was having breakfast this morning in a hotel not very far away from the cinema, that in a curious way, the picture making in Venice always remains the same. I need to explain that, but so let me just show you how the film begins. This is very, very self-reflexive. It's basically the same film made 3 times, based upon the number 13. 13 because Vivaldi, whose music is included in the last section, is often based indeed on the number 13. So there are resonances all the time about attitudes, both real and mythical, in association with Venice. Certainly a perverse film. If anything, Venice is certainly known to be a city of water. But there's absolutely no indication of water whatsoever in that film. You can see, of course, that it's very much an editing exercise, but as always relative to what I like to do, that the narration or the so-called narrativity doesn't exist with inside the film, but is imposed from outside. It's a very external, what do they call it, an exoskeleton, rather than being created by the anecdotal dynamics of the actual structure of the narrative. The organization is an external thing and not an internal thing. And time again, I have tried indeed to make that a condition of my filmmaking. Here's something completely different. I was 21 in 1963, and the major concern for all young people at that time was indeed the ultimate end of the world with the Khrushchev-Kennedy confrontation over Cuba. So the notion of indeed Armageddon created by imminent nuclear war was certainly very, very present amongst all young people. It hasn't gone away, of course, through the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. Other concerns for young people like too many people, 70 billion people in the world, notions of pollution, etc., etc. But now, with the new political situation probably in America, the whole concept of nuclear Armageddon is coming closer and closer and closer again, and was indicated in the introduction. The number 92, the atomic number of uranium, came to be a signifier for me. As I explained before, I tried to find the simplest organizations and structures without going into complicated Henry Jamesian anecdotal narrativity, which I believe is a curse in cinema. There's a way that I have used 92 over and over again as a particular dramatic way in which to remind people of imminent destruction, or if everything goes well and we come to be able to handle this, we will allow the fridge in your kitchen to run for another 30 million years. Atomic power certainly is the answer to the end, or in a curious way to the beginning. Here is a way that the dream and the nightmare, more probably the nightmare, of atomic bomb is being realized. This has now become a flagship film for nuclear war pacifism that's existing all over the world and is constantly trundled around to preface a whole series of films which are enormously growing in number about conditions about the atomic bomb. We've simply called it, what have we called it? We've simply called it 42 Atomic Bombs. Have a look. You have to stay with this. You have to really stay with this film. When the nuclear nations were very proud of having nuclear power, they of course advertised it because that was the whole deterrent notion of what having nuclear power was. I rather suspect as many atomic bombs have been dropped on the Earth since then and probably multiplied by much more. But now it's important to keep it secret. And every single piece of film we used in this demonstration, indeed, how the poor Earth has been pummeled by atomic explosions, every single piece is on public record. Otherwise, I would never have been able to get hold of it. But we indicate the place, the nation involved, the timing, and often the extraordinary poetic names that the bombs were called. Okay, from that sense of Armageddon, let me show you something else. I am absolutely convinced that Jesus Christ was married to Mary Magdalena, and we are about to make a film simply called The Marriage of Christ, which is very much based upon a painter who's extremely well represented in this city, whose name is Veronese. They put me in a hotel, again, not very far away from here, where the entire interior, I hadn't realized it was painted, indeed, by this august Venetian painting. I have an idea, you certainly know what painting that I'm talking about, which is the celebrated marriage of Cana, which I believe is the marriage of Christ, highly disguised by the early Christian apologists who could not imagine remotely that Jesus Christ had a sex life. Let me show you a clip of the film we made, indeed, about this extraordinary painting. Thank you for your attention.
Ora vi vedete? Fermo?